In the autumn of 1893, a coffin opened from the inside. That sentence alone should be impossible. A sealed coffin, resting on iron trestles in the private chapel of Harrogate Funeral House, watched over by a family in mourning, surrounded by candles and cold stone and the particular silence that belongs only to the dead. And yet, when the chapel doors were unlocked at 5:30 on the morning of October the 14th, the lid of that coffin had been forced upward. The silk lining was torn. The brass seal, which had been fastened the previous evening in the presence of 4 witnesses, was broken from within, and the body of Mr. Edmund Calverton, aged 58, patriarch of one of London's most quietly powerful shipping families, was no longer lying as it had been placed. He was still inside, but he had moved. His arms, which had been folded across his chest in the customary position of repose, were now raised. One hand pressed flat against the interior of the lid. The other gripped the satin edge of the lining, fingers curled, knuckles white with a tension that should not exist in a man who had been dead for 3 days. His mouth, which the undertaker had carefully closed and set with a thin wire behind the lips, was open, not wide, not screaming, just slightly parted, as though he had been about to say one final word and the effort had taken everything he had left. The family was summoned, the undertaker was questioned, the chapel was examined, and within 2 hours, the story had begun to spread through the wet October streets of Rotherhithe and beyond. Carried by servants and drivers, and the particular breed of London gossip that moves faster in rain than in sunshine. A dead man had tried to climb out of his coffin. By noon, it had reached Baker Street. Sherlock Holmes received the details not through a newspaper and not through Scotland Yard, but through a single handwritten note delivered by a boy no older than 12, who arrived soaked and breathing hard, and who refused to give his name. The note was unsigned. It was written on mourning stationery, the kind with the black border, and the handwriting was careful, educated, and slightly unsteady. It contained only 3 lines. The coffin of Edmund Calverton was sealed at 8 o'clock last evening. By morning it had been opened from inside. Please come before they close it again. Holmes read the note twice. He held the paper to the light and studied the watermark. He touched the edge where the ink had smeared from the rain and observed that the black mourning border had been added by hand, not printed, which meant the stationery had been adapted in haste from ordinary writing paper. He noted that the word please had been pressed harder than the other words, leaving a slight indentation visible on the reverse. And then he set the note down, looked at me and said, "Someone in that family is more afraid of the living than the dead." We took a cab south through the rain. London in October has a way of folding in on itself, the fog thickening between buildings until streets become corridors, and the city feels not like a place but like a structure built to contain things people would rather not see. Rotherhithe, at the edge of the river, was worse. The Thames was high and grey that morning, and the streets near the old docks carried the smell of damp rope and coal dust and something older, something mineral and cold that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Harrogate Funeral House sat at the end of a narrow lane, lined with elm trees whose branches had gone black with moisture. It was a handsome building, or had been, 3 stories of dark brick with a slate roof and tall windows that reflected nothing. A chapel had been added to the east side sometime in the previous century, connected to the main house by a short stone passage. Behind the chapel, partly hidden by a low wall and an iron gate, lay the entrance to the Calverton family crypt. The crypt was old, far older than the funeral house. It had been built into the hillside when the land still belonged to a church that no longer existed, and its stones were green with age and streaked with dark veins of water that never fully dried. The Calvertons had purchased it decades ago, when Edmund's father had made his fortune in coastal freight, and decided that his family's dead deserved a permanent address. There were 11 Calvertons already inside. Edmund was to have been the 12th. We were met at the door by a man named Sutfield, who managed the funeral house and who had the particular quality of professional grief that undertakers develop over years of standing between the living and the dead. He was tall, thin, pale, in the way that suggested not illness but simply a life spent largely indoors and largely in the company of silence. He shook our hands with a dry, careful grip and led us through a hallway that smelled of furniture polish and lilies, and something underneath both, something chemical and sweet that I recognized from my years in medicine, but chose not to name. "I have managed this house for 22 years, Sutfield said quietly as we walked. "I have prepared over 300 bodies. I have never seen anything like what happened in that chapel." "When did you seal the coffin?" Holmes asked. "At 8 o'clock last evening, as the family requested. The seal is a brass locking mechanism threaded into the lid and the base from the exterior. Once engaged, it cannot be released without a key. The key was in my possession all night. It is still in my possession now. And the lid was split. Not split entirely, forced upward. The wood around the left side hinge has cracked, and the brass plate on that side has bent outward. The right side hinge held, so the lid opened unevenly, like a jaw." Holmes paused in the hallway. "You said the body had moved." "Yes." Sutfield's voice dropped, not for drama, but from genuine unease. "The arms were repositioned, the mouth was open. I set that mouth myself, Mr. Holmes. I used a mandibular suture. It should not have come undone." "And who discovered this?" "I did. I unlock the chapel each morning at 5:30 to check the temperature and the candles. When I opened the doors, I saw the lid immediately. I approached. I looked inside, and I knew at once that something had happened that I could not explain." Holmes studied the man for a long moment. "How many people have access to this building at night?" "Only myself. I live on the upper floor. The doors are locked at 9. The windows are barred on the ground level. There is no rear entrance to the chapel except through the passage from the main house, and that door was bolted from my side." "And the crypt?" "The crypt is separate. It is accessed from the cemetery through an iron gate which is padlocked. That padlock was intact this morning, I checked. We entered the chapel. It was a small room, cold and high-ceilinged, with stone walls and a flagstone floor and 4 tall windows of plain glass that let in the grey morning light without warmth. 6 rows of wooden chairs faced the front, where the coffin rested on its trestles. Candles, now guttered and cold, stood in iron holders on either side. The air was still. The silence was the kind that presses against you. The coffin was oak, dark-stained, with brass fittings. The lid had been forced upward on the left side, just as Sutfield described. The wood was cracked along the grain, a long fracture running from the hinge to the midpoint of the lid, and the brass locking plate on that side was visibly bent. The right side held, so the lid sat at an angle, open perhaps 4 inches on the left and still flush on the right. Holmes approached slowly. He did not touch the coffin immediately. Instead, he walked around it, studying the floor, the trestles, the base of the coffin, the candle holders, the chairs nearest the front. He crouched and examined the flagstones beneath the trestles. He looked at the underside of the coffin where it met the iron supports. He studied the walls near the coffin, running his fingers along the stone at waist height. Only then did he look inside. I looked as well. Edmund Calverton lay as Sutfield had described. His arms were raised, his left hand pressed against the inner surface of the lid, his right hand gripping the lining. His face was grey and sunken and entirely still, but his mouth was open, and in the thin chapel light, the expression it created was not one of terror. It was one of effort, as though the body had been arranged to suggest a final desperate act of will. Holmes studied the hands. He leaned close and examined the fingernails, the skin of the palms, the position of the wrists. He looked at the torn silk lining and touched it lightly at the point of greatest damage. He examined the mandibular suture that Sutfield had mentioned, the fine wire that had held the jaw closed and was now loose, one end still embedded in the gum tissue, the other hanging free. He studied the eyes, which were closed, and the eyelids, which appeared undisturbed, and then he straightened and stood very still for nearly a full minute, looking not at the body but at the coffin itself, at the way the lid had broken, at the angle of the fracture, at the precise location of the bent brass plate. "The force that opened this coffin," Holmes said at last, "was not applied from inside." Sutfield blinked. "I beg your pardon. The wood has fractured along the grain from the hinge outward. If a man were pushing upward from within, the force would concentrate at the center of the lid, where the hands could gain the most leverage. The fracture would radiate from that central point. But this fracture begins at the hinge itself and moves inward. The brass plate has been bent outward, yes, but the screws that held it have not been pulled from the wood. They have been pushed. The force came from outside, applied at the hinge with a thin, rigid instrument, something like a pry bar or a heavy chisel, and the lid was levered open from the left side while the right side was held in place. But the body, Sutfield said, the arms, the mouth were repositioned afterward. The hands were placed against the lid and the lining deliberately. The mandibular suture was cut, not torn. If you examine the free end of the wire under magnification, I believe you will find a clean edge, not a frayed one. Someone opened this coffin from outside, rearranged the body to suggest it had moved on its own, and then left the chapel before morning. The room was quiet. Rain struck the windows. "Why?" I asked. Holmes turned to me. "That, Watson, is the only question that matters. Not how, but why. Who would break into a sealed coffin in the middle of the night? Not to steal anything, not to harm a body that is already dead, but to make it appear as though a dead man had tried to escape his own burial. What purpose does that serve? What fear does it create? And in whom?" He paused. "We are not investigating a haunting, we are investigating a message, and that message was intended for someone in the Calverton family." The Calverton family gathered in the parlor of Harrogate Funeral House at 11 o'clock that morning, summoned not by Holmes but by their own compulsion to manage what they could not explain. There were 5 of them, and each arrived separately, which told me something before any of them spoke. The eldest was Arthur Calverton, Edmund's son, a man of 34 who had inherited his father's shipping interests 6 months before his father died, a detail Holmes noted immediately. Arthur was well dressed, controlled, and spoke with the careful precision of a man who has practiced authority but does not yet fully believe in it. He stood near the window and did not sit down. Beside him, eventually came his wife, Margaret, a woman of 30 who carried herself with a particular kind of stillness that I have learned to recognize, the stillness of someone who is listening to everything and trusting nothing. She wore mourning clothes that fit perfectly, which meant they had been prepared in advance, not purchased in haste after the death. The second son was Philip Calverton, 29, thinner than his brother, quieter, with the sort of face that in better circumstances might have been called scholarly, but in this light looked merely exhausted. He sat in the corner nearest the door, as far from Arthur as the room allowed, and he kept his hands in his lap and his eyes on the floor. Then came Helena Calverton, Edmund's sister, 61 years old, unmarried, who lived in a house on the funeral grounds that had been provided for her by Edmund himself. She was a tall woman, angular, with sharp eyes and a mouth that seemed permanently set against saying what she actually thought. She sat in the center of the room as though it belonged to her, and last, arriving almost 20 minutes after the others, was a woman named Constance Dyer, who was introduced to us as the family's longtime companion, and who, I learned later, had served as Edmund's private nurse during the final months of his illness. She was 45, plain, composed, and she entered the room without apology for her lateness and without looking at any of the others. Holmes observed them all. He did not immediately speak. He let the silence work, and in that silence I watched what he watched. Arthur checked his watch twice. Margaret touched the brooch at her collar, a gesture that seemed unconscious, but that she repeated exactly, suggesting it was not unconscious at all, but a form of self-reassurance she had developed into habit. Philip stared at the floor. Helena looked at Constance, and Constance looked at no one. "I have examined the coffin," Holmes said, and the room tightened. "The damage was not caused from within. It was caused by someone using a tool to lever the lid open from the outside. The body was then rearranged to create the impression of movement. This was not a supernatural event. It was a deliberate act performed by someone with access to this building, knowledge of the coffin's construction, and a specific intention to disturb this family." Arthur spoke first. "Then it was a break-in, a desecration. We should involve the police." "The police have been notified," Holmes said. "They will arrive this afternoon. But I do not believe this was a break-in. There is no sign of forced entry to the building. The windows are barred, the doors were locked, the crypt gate was untouched. Whoever did this was already inside or had a means of entry that has not yet been revealed." The silence that followed was different from the first. The first silence had been expectant. This one was afraid. "You are suggesting," Helena said, her voice careful and level, "that someone in this house did this." "I am suggesting that someone with intimate knowledge of this house, this family, and this funeral did this. Whether that person is in this room, I do not yet know, but I will." Philip looked up from the floor for the first time. His eyes moved to Arthur, then away. Margaret's hand went to her brooch again, and Constance Dyer, the companion, the nurse, the woman who had been with Edmund Calverton in his final months, did something that only Holmes and I noticed. She closed her eyes, not in grief, not in shock, in recognition, as though she had been waiting for this moment and it had finally arrived. Holmes began his interviews in the small study adjoining the parlor, a room lined with books that no one had read and furnished with a desk that smelled of ink and dust and old decisions. He spoke to each family member alone, and I was permitted to remain, though I suspect this was less a courtesy to me than a tactical choice, a second pair of eyes trained in observing physical discomfort and the small physiological signals of deception. Arthur Calverton sat opposite Holmes with the posture of a man at a board meeting, upright, shoulders square, hands flat on the desk. He answered questions directly and without hesitation, which in itself was noteworthy. Most people, when confronted with the unexplained, stumble. They circle. They qualify. Arthur did none of this. He spoke about his father's death with the same measured tone he might use to describe a quarterly report. "My father died on the 11th of October at approximately 4 in the afternoon. He had been ill for some time, a respiratory condition worsening over the final year. Dr. Briggs attended him. The death was not unexpected. And the transfer of business interests," Holmes said. "That occurred before his death." A pause. "Not long, but present. Yes. 6 months prior, my father wished to ensure a smooth transition. He was a practical man." "Was Philip involved in the transition?" "Philip has no involvement in the business. By his own choice." "By his own choice," Holmes repeated, and the way he said it left the phrase hanging in the air, neither accepted nor challenged, simply exposed. "My brother has different interests. My father respected that." "Did he?" Arthur's jaw tightened. It was a small movement, but I saw it, and I knew Holmes saw it. My father and Philip had a complex relationship, as many fathers and sons do, but Philip was provided for. He was not excluded. "And yet he sits in the corner of the room farthest from you, and he has not spoken to you this morning." Arthur stared at Holmes for a moment, then stood. "I came here to help find who desecrated my father's body, not to discuss family dynamics." "Mr. Calverton," Holmes said quietly, "whoever opened that coffin understood your family dynamics intimately. If you wish to find them, you will need to be more honest about those dynamics than you are currently being. Not with me, with yourself." Arthur left the room without another word, but at the door he paused. He did not turn around. He simply stood there for a moment, one hand on the frame, and in that pause I saw something I had not expected. Not anger, not defiance, fear. The kind of fear that comes not from what might be discovered about you, but from what you already know about yourself and have spent years refusing to name. If you have been following this story, stay with it. The coffin was only the beginning. What it opened was far deeper than wood and brass. Margaret Calverton was next, and she was a different kind of challenge. Where Arthur had been controlled, Margaret was precise. She answered every question with exactly enough information to be helpful and not one word more. She was intelligent, watchful, and she had the particular gift of making silence feel like cooperation rather than resistance. "How long have you been married to Arthur?" Holmes asked. 6 years. "And in that time, how would you describe his relationship with his father?" "Respectful, dutiful." Dutiful is an interesting word. It suggests obligation rather than affection. Margaret looked at Holmes with an expression I had seen in very few people, a calm, direct acknowledgement that she had been understood, and that she was not yet prepared to confirm it. Edmund was not an easy man to love. He was an easy man to respect. Arthur respected him deeply. And Philip. Philip loved his father. That was his misfortune. It was the most revealing thing anyone had said all morning, and Margaret seemed to realize it a moment after she said it. Her hand went to her brooch. She pressed it briefly, then released it. "Why was that a misfortune?" Holmes asked. "Because Edmund did not know what to do with love. He understood duty, obligation, transaction, legacy. But love confused him. It made him uncomfortable, and people who are uncomfortable with love tend to punish those who offer it." Did Edmund punish Philip? Not deliberately. Never deliberately. But Philip wanted his father's approval, and Edmund could only give approval in the language of business, of achievement, of measurable success. Philip is a scholar, a reader, a man of thought. Edmund did not have a grammar for that. So Philip spent his life reaching for something his father could not give, and Edmund spent his life bewildered by a son who wanted something he did not understand. She paused. "It is the most common tragedy in the world, Mr. Holmes, and the least visible." Holmes nodded. "One more question, Mrs. Calverton. The mourning clothes you are wearing, they were fitted before Edmund's death." It was not a question, but Margaret answered it. "Yes. I ordered them 3 weeks ago. When Dr. Briggs told us the end was near." "Is that what you're looking for? Evidence that I am cold, practical, that I prepared for a death that was coming and did not pretend otherwise?" "I am looking for evidence that someone in this family was already preparing for what would happen after Edmund died. Not grieving, preparing. You have just confirmed that at least one person was." Margaret stood. "Everyone in this family was preparing, Mr. Holmes. That is what families do when someone is dying. They prepare. The question is, what each of them was preparing for." She left, and the room felt emptier than it should have, as though she had taken something with her that had been holding the walls in place. Philip Calverton entered the study the way a man enters a room he has been dreading. He sat down slowly. He did not meet Holmes's eyes. His hands, which had been still in the parlor, now moved constantly, touching the edge of the desk, adjusting his cuffs, pressing his fingertips together. "You loved your father," Holmes said. It was not an opening, it was a key. Philip's hands stopped moving. He looked up. His eyes were red, but not from recent crying. From days of it. From the accumulated exhaustion of grief that has nowhere to go, because the people around you have already decided how the grieving should look, and you do not match their template. "Yes," Philip said, and he did not know how to receive that. Philip's mouth tightened. "My father was a good man. He built something from nothing. He provided for all of us. He was generous and fair and disciplined, and he never once told me he was proud of me. Not once in 29 years. His voice cracked on the last word, and he pressed his fist against his mouth for a moment, holding himself together with a physical force that was painful to witness. "When did you last see him alive?" Holmes asked gently. "The morning of the day he died. I sat with him for an hour. He was mostly unconscious. I read to him Tennyson. He never liked Tennyson. He thought poetry was indulgent, but I read it anyway because I had spent my whole life trying to share the things I loved with him, and I was not going to stop at the end." "Did he wake?" "Once. Briefly. He opened his eyes and looked at me, and I thought, this is the moment. This is when he will say it. Whatever it is. Anything." Philip swallowed. He asked me to send Arthur in. The room was very quiet. I left. Arthur went in. My father died that afternoon. Arthur was with him. And you were not. I was in the garden. Constance came to tell me. She was very kind about it. She said it was peaceful. She said he simply stopped breathing. I do not know if that is true. I think she said it because it was what I needed to hear, and Constance has always understood what people need to hear. Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Philip, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Not because I suspect you, but because I believe you see things in this family that the others do not." The coffin was opened deliberately. The body was arranged to suggest something impossible. Who in your family would do that, and what would they be trying to say? Philip looked at Holmes for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was steady but barely above a whisper. Everyone in my family is carrying something they cannot say. Arthur is carrying the weight of a business he inherited before he was ready, and a father who chose him not because he was the best, but because he was the most obedient. Helena is carrying decades of silence about things she saw in this family that she was told to ignore. Constance is carrying something I cannot name, but I can feel whenever she enters a room, something heavy and old and private. And I am carrying the knowledge that my father died without ever really seeing me. He paused. If you want to know who opened that coffin, Mr. Holmes, ask yourself who in this family had something they needed the dead to hear. Holmes let him go, and as Philip passed me at the door, I saw his face clearly, and what I saw there was not suspicion or fear or grief alone, but the particular loneliness of a person who has understood everyone around them and been understood by no one. Helena Calverton sat down with the authority of a woman who had been waiting her entire life to be consulted and was determined to make it count. She was precise, firm, and she answered questions as though she were giving testimony in a court she had already judged to be beneath her. I have lived on these grounds for 17 years, she said. Edmund provided the house. It was not charity. It was acknowledgement. I managed his household for 11 years after his wife died. I raised those boys as much as anyone did. I have earned my place here. No one is questioning your place, Holmes said. Everyone questions a woman's place, Mr. Holmes, especially an unmarried woman who is financially dependent on a family that considers dependency a form of weakness. I am aware of how I am perceived. I am aware that Arthur would prefer I lived elsewhere. I am aware that my presence is tolerated rather than welcomed. I have been aware of this for some time. And Edmund, how did he feel about your presence? Helena's expression shifted. The sharpness softened, just barely, just at the edges. Edmund needed me. He would never have said so. He would never have admitted that the running of his house, the raising of his children, the management of his social obligations after Catherine's death, all of it fell to me. He accepted my help the way he accepted air, without noticing, without gratitude, but with absolute dependence. Catherine was his wife. And she died 23 years ago of scarlet fever, and Edmund mourned her for exactly 6 months, and then closed every door in that part of his life and never opened them again. He removed her photographs from the house. He stored her belongings. He forbade the boys from mentioning her at dinner. He did not visit her grave. He did everything a man does when he is in such pain that the only solution he can conceive of is erasure. And you filled the space she left. I filled the function, not the space. No one filled the space. That space remained empty for 23 years, and Edmund stood at the edge of it every day and pretended it was not there. And everyone around him agreed to the pretense, because it was easier than watching a strong man break. Holmes was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, Helena, what do you believe happened in that chapel last night? Helena looked at him directly. I believe someone wanted to remind this family that the dead do not stay buried just because you close the lid. That is a metaphor. Everything in this family is a metaphor, Mr. Holmes. We have been speaking in metaphors for decades. The coffin was simply the first honest thing that has happened to us in years. She left, and the room filled with the particular silence that follows a statement no one can argue with. Constance Dyer was the last to enter, and she was the quietest, and she was the one Holmes watched most carefully. She sat with her hands folded and her posture straight, and her face composed in the way that people who work closely with the dying learn to compose themselves, a practiced stillness that protects not against grief, but against the constant, grinding proximity of it. She looked at Holmes without anxiety, without eagerness, and without the defensive posture that each of the Calvertons had carried into the room. You were Edmund's nurse, Holmes said. For the final 8 months, yes. And before that, I was employed by the family in a general capacity. I managed correspondence. I assisted Helena with household affairs. When Edmund became ill, the role changed. How did it change? I spent most of my time with him, in his room, managing his medication, his comfort, his daily needs. It is an intimate role. You come to know a person very well when you are the one who helps them breathe, who adjusts their pillows, who sits with them at 3 in the morning when the pain is worst and the house is silent, and they are more afraid than they will ever admit to anyone else. Did Edmund speak to you during those nights? Constance was still for a moment. He did. About what? About many things. About the business, about the boys, about the house, about his fears. She paused. About Catherine. Holmes leaned forward. He spoke to you about his late wife. In the final weeks, yes. Frequently. He had not spoken her name in years, according to Helena, but in those last weeks, she was all he talked about. Not the facts of her, not her death, but the feeling of her. The absence. He said that the worst thing about grief is not that it fades, but that it doesn't. He said he had spent 23 years pretending it had faded, and the pretending had cost him everything. What did he mean by everything? Constance looked at Holmes with an expression that was the first fully unguarded one I had seen from anyone that morning. He meant his sons. He meant Philip. He said that he had closed himself off so thoroughly after Catherine's death that he had lost the ability to open again, and by the time he realized what that had cost him, Philip had already learned to stop reaching. He said that was the thing he was most ashamed of, not anything he had done, but the reaching that he had made his son stop doing. The room was heavy with something I could not name but could feel, the weight of a confession delivered second-hand from a dead man, through the only person he had trusted enough to receive it. Constance, Holmes said quietly, did Edmund ask you to do anything before he died? Any final request? Any instruction? Constance's composure held, but her eyes changed. The stillness in them deepened, and beneath it I saw something moving, something old and heavy and carefully contained. He asked me to make sure the truth came out, she said. He did not say what truth. He said I would know. And do you? She looked at Holmes for a long time. I am beginning to. Holmes did not press further. He thanked her, and she left. And when the door closed, Holmes sat back and steepled his fingers and said nothing for several minutes. The rain had intensified outside, and the sound of it against the chapel windows was steady and persistent, like something trying to get in. What are you thinking? I asked. I am thinking, Holmes said, that this family has been performing a funeral for a man they never fully knew, and that someone decided the performance was insufficient. The coffin was not opened to frighten them. It was open to force a conversation that living speech had failed to produce. He stood and walked to the window. There are 2 mysteries here, Watson. The first is mechanical. Who opened the coffin, and how did they access the chapel? That question has a straightforward answer, and I am close to it. The second mystery is emotional. Why did they do it? What truth is so urgent that someone felt it could only be delivered through an act of apparent resurrection? That question is more complex, and its answer lies not in the chapel, but in the space between these people, in the things they have not said to each other, in the silences they have maintained for years, in the careful, exhausting architecture of avoidance that this family has built around a single central wound. Catherine's death. No, not her death. Her erasure. Edmund did not just lose his wife, he erased her. He removed her from the household, from conversation, from memory. And in doing so, he created a void at the center of this family that every person in it has been navigating around, compensating for and suffering from ever since. Arthur became the dutiful son because duty was the only currency his father recognized. Philip became the invisible son because he offered love, and love had been declared irrelevant. Helena became the functional replacement for a woman she could never fully replace. And Constance became the confidant, the last keeper of a truth that Edmund spent 23 years burying. He turned from the window. The coffin opening is not the mystery. The coffin opening is the culmination. It is the physical manifestation of something that has been trying to surface in this family for over 2 decades, and whoever staged it knew that. They knew this family, they knew its wound, and they knew that the only way to make these people face what they have been hiding from was to make the dead appear to speak. There is something I want you to consider as we go deeper into what happened at Harrogate. Think about the secrets that live inside the families you know. Think about the things that are never spoken at the dinner table, the subjects that everyone navigates around as though they were furniture that has always been there. Every family has a coffin. Not everyone has the courage to open it. Holmes spent the next 2 hours examining the physical evidence with a thoroughness that I had come to expect but never ceased to admire. He began with the chapel itself, measuring the dimensions of the room, testing each window for signs of tampering, examining the locks on both doors, the main entrance from the corridor and the rear door leading to the stone passage that connected to the funeral house. Both locks were intact. Both keys were accounted for. The windows were barred with iron that showed no marks of removal or interference. But Holmes did not stop at the obvious entry points. He examined the floor of the chapel stone by stone, crouching low with his lens, studying the flagstones for scratches, moisture patterns, and disturbances in the mortar. Near the rear wall, behind the last row of chairs, he found something. A thin line of fresh mortar dust, barely visible against the grey stone, running along the base of the wall for approximately 3 feet. He traced it with his finger and then pressed against the wall at several points. On the third press, a section of the stone shifted. Not much, perhaps half an inch. But enough. "There is a passage behind this wall," Holmes said, "or there was. It has been sealed, but recently the seal was disturbed. Someone who knew this building's original construction knew that this wall was not always solid." He examined the mortar more closely. "This has been resealed within the last year, fresh lime mortar over old stone. But last night, someone loosened it enough to pass through and then pressed it back into place. The work is crude but effective in poor light. No one would notice unless they were looking." "Where does the passage lead?" I asked. "Based on the orientation of the building, it leads to the crypt." The chapel and the crypt were once connected. When the funeral house was expanded, the passage was closed, but someone remembered it or discovered it. He stood and brushed the dust from his knees. "This changes the field of suspects. Access to the chapel was not limited to those inside the funeral house. Anyone who knew about this passage and who had access to the crypt could have entered the chapel, opened the coffin, rearranged the body, and left again without Sutfield ever knowing. The crypt is padlocked from outside. The padlock was intact this morning, but a padlock can be opened with a key, closed again afterward, and appear undisturbed. The question is, who has a key to the crypt? We found Sutfield in his office, a small, meticulously ordered room that smelled of beeswax and paper. Holmes asked about the crypt key. Sutfield explained that there were 2 keys. One was held by the funeral house. The other was held by the Calverton family. Who in the family holds the key? It was Edmund's. After his death, it would pass to Arthur as the eldest son. But I do not know if it has been formally transferred. Edmund kept it on a chain in his study at the family home. Has anyone from the family visited the crypt recently? Sutfield hesitated. Helena visits regularly. She tends the graves, brings flowers, she has her own arrangement with us. She uses the funeral house key, which I lend her, and she returns it the same day. When was her last visit? 3 days ago, the day Edmund died. She went to the crypt that morning, before we knew Edmund had passed. She said she wanted to prepare the space. Holmes nodded slowly. And did anyone else ask to visit the crypt in the past week? Sutfield thought carefully. Philip came once, 5 days ago. He asked to see his mother's grave, Catherine Calverton. She is interred in the crypt. He stayed for perhaps half an hour. He seemed very upset when he left. Holmes and I exchanged a look. Philip had not mentioned this visit. Neither had anyone else. We walked to the crypt. The iron gate was set into the hillside, green with age, and flanked by stone pillars that had begun to lean inward, giving the entrance the appearance of something slowly closing. The padlock was heavy, old, and showed no obvious signs of recent tampering. But Holmes examined it under his lens and found what he expected, fresh scratches on the interior of the keyhole, the kind left by a key that has been inserted and turned recently, within the last 48 hours. Inside, the crypt was cold and dark, and smelled of old stone and damp earth and the particular stillness of places where time has been deliberately stopped. 11 stone markers lined the walls, each bearing a name and dates, and at the far end, an empty niche waited for Edmund. The floor was stone, and our footsteps echoed in a way that made the space feel larger than it was. Holmes moved through the crypt systematically, examining each wall, each niche, each marker. He paused at Catherine Calverton's marker. It was the oldest in the crypt, placed 23 years ago, and unlike the others, it bore not only a name and dates but an inscription. Beloved beyond words. Holmes studied the inscription, then looked at the stone beneath it, at the floor in front of the niche, at the wall on either side. "Watson," he said, "bring the lantern closer." I did. In the strengthened light, I could see what had caught his attention. The mortar around Catherine's marker was different from the mortar around the others. The others were sealed with the original lime mortar, aged and dark. Catherine's marker had been resealed. The mortar was lighter in color, slightly different in texture. It had been done carefully, by someone who knew what they were doing, but it was not original. "This marker has been removed and replaced," Holmes said. "Not recently. Some years ago, perhaps. But it has been disturbed." Why would someone open Catherine's niche? Holmes did not answer immediately. He was examining the wall at the far end of the crypt, the wall that, by his calculations, backed onto the chapel. He found the sealed passage quickly, a section of stone approximately 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall that had been filled with newer masonry. The mortar here, too, showed signs of recent disturbance, the same fresh lime dust he had found on the chapel side. "Someone came through here last night," Holmes said. "From the crypt, through this passage into the chapel. They opened the coffin, rearranged the body, and returned the same way. They resealed the passage from the crypt side, exited through the iron gate, and relocked the padlock behind them. But the passage is sealed with stone and mortar. You cannot simply walk through it. You can if the seal is designed to be removed and replaced, if the stones are fitted without permanent mortar, held in place by pressure and a thin skim of fresh lime that can be broken and reapplied. Someone has converted this sealed passage into a door that looks like a wall." Holmes stood in the cold darkness of the crypt and looked back toward the entrance. "This was not done last night. This passage was prepared in advance. Someone has been coming and going between the crypt and the chapel for some time, unseen, undetected. The question is no longer only who opened Edmund's coffin. The question is who has been visiting this crypt in secret, and what have they been doing here?" He walked back to Catherine's marker. He stood before it for a long moment, his lantern casting shadows that made the inscription move. "Beloved beyond words," he read aloud. Then, quietly to himself, but not beyond silence. We returned to the funeral house as the afternoon light began to fail. The rain had not stopped. It had settled into the kind of steady, relentless fall that makes London feel like a city at the bottom of something, submerged, patient, waiting. Holmes asked to see Edmund Calverton's death certificate. Sutfield provided it. The cause of death was listed as respiratory failure secondary to chronic pulmonary disease. The attending physician was Dr. James Briggs, who had been the Calverton family's physician for over a decade. The certificate was signed and dated the 11th of October. Holmes studied the certificate for several minutes. Then he asked for the records of Edmund's medication during his final weeks. Sutfield did not have these, but suggested we speak with Constance Dyer, who had managed Edmund's care. We found Constance in the small sitting room adjacent to the chapel, alone, drinking tea that had gone cold. She looked up when we entered, and I saw in her face the expression of someone who has been waiting and is almost relieved that the waiting is over. "I need to ask you about Edmund's medication," Holmes said. Constance nodded. "Dr. Briggs prescribed morphine for the pain. Laudanum at first, then injectable morphine as the condition worsened. I administered it according to his instructions." "How much and how often?" "Initially, small doses, twice daily. In the final 2 weeks, the dosage increased significantly. Dr. Briggs visited every other day to assess and adjust. By the last week, Edmund was receiving doses that I considered very high, but Dr. Briggs assured me they were appropriate for the level of pain." "Did you record the doses?" "I did. In a notebook. I have it at my quarters. I will need to see it." Constance looked at him steadily. "You will find that the doses prescribed were higher than what is customary for a man of Edmund's weight and condition. I noted this at the time. I raised it with Dr. Briggs. He told me that Edmund's pain was exceptional and that the doses were necessary. I accepted this because I trusted his judgment. I am no longer certain I should have." The room shifted. The air itself seemed to change weight. "Are you saying," Holmes said carefully, "that you believe Edmund's death may have been hastened?" "I am saying that I have questions I did not ask while he was alive, and I should have. I am saying that in the final days the dosage increased sharply, and each increase was authorized by Dr. Briggs after private conversations with Arthur. Not with me, not with Philip, not with Helena, with Arthur alone." "Did Arthur visit his father during those final days?" "Every day. He would arrive in the afternoon, speak with Dr. Briggs in the hallway, and then sit with his father for precisely 1 hour. He was very consistent, very controlled. He never stayed longer, he never came earlier. It was like a business appointment." "And the final day?" "Arthur arrived at his usual time. Dr. Briggs had visited that morning and increased the dosage again. Arthur sat with his father for his usual hour. Philip had been with Edmund that morning. Arthur came after Philip left. I stepped out to prepare Edmund's evening medication. When I returned, Edmund was unconscious. He died approximately 2 hours later. Arthur was still in the room. Was anyone else present at the moment of death? No. I was in the hallway. Philip was in the garden. Helena was in her house. Margaret was in the parlor. Arthur was alone with him. Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then he asked, "Constance, what did Edmund ask you to do?" "You said he asked you to make sure the truth came out." "What truth?" Constance set down her cold tea. Her hands were steady, but her voice, when she spoke, carried a weight that steadiness could not disguise. 3 days before he died, Edmund was lucid for several hours. It was one of his last clear periods. He asked me to sit with him, and he told me something that I have not told anyone else. He said that Catherine did not die of scarlet fever. The rain outside was loud. Inside, there was nothing. He said that Catherine was ill, yes, but that she was recovering. He said that Dr. Briggs, who was already the family physician at that time, made an error in her treatment. A significant error. An error that, if it had been discovered, would have ended Briggs's career and exposed the Calverton family to scandal. Edmund said that he and Briggs agreed to conceal the error. They attributed Catherine's death to the fever. They buried the truth with her, and Edmund carried that secret for 23 years. Yes. He said it was the reason he could not grieve her properly. He said that every time he looked at her photograph, every time he heard her name, he did not feel loss. He felt guilt. And the guilt was so unbearable that the only way he could survive it was to erase her entirely, to remove every trace of her from his life, so that he would not have to face what he had done, what he had allowed to be done. Yes, he was not the one who made the error, but he was the one who agreed to hide it. And the hiding, he said, had destroyed him. It had destroyed his ability to be a father, a human being, a man capable of love. It had turned him into a machine of duty and obligation and control, because those were the only things that did not require him to feel. Holmes stood and walked to the window. The cemetery was visible through the glass, the stones dark and wet, the trees bare. The crypt entrance was a shadow against the hillside. "And you," Holmes said, still facing the window, "what did you do with this knowledge?" Constance's voice was very quiet. "I did what he asked. I began to make sure the truth came out." "You opened the coffin?" It was not a question. I opened the coffin. I know the passage between the crypt and the chapel. I discovered it months ago when I was exploring the crypt after one of Helena's visits. I saw the stonework. I tested it. I realized it could be opened. I prepared it over several weeks, loosening the mortar, fitting the stones so they could be removed and replaced. And last night, after the chapel was locked and the house was dark, I entered through the crypt, came through the passage, and opened the coffin. "You arranged the body?" "Yes. I positioned his arms. I opened his mouth. I wanted it to look as though he were trying to speak, because that is what he was trying to do, Mr. Holmes. In his final days, he was trying to speak. He was trying to tell the truth, and he ran out of time. And the truth was sealed inside him, just as it was sealed inside that coffin, and I could not bear it. I could not bear the thought of this family burying him with his silence intact, closing that crypt, locking the gate, and walking away as though everything was settled, as though the performance of grief were sufficient, as though respectability could substitute for honesty. She paused. Her composure, which had held for so long, trembled at the edges. I opened the coffin because Edmund could not. I made the dead appear to speak because the living would not listen. Stay with this. We are close now to the center of it, and the center is not what you expect. Holmes turned from the window. His expression was not one of triumph at having solved the mechanical mystery. It was something more complex, something I had rarely seen in him, a kind of recognition, as though he were seeing in Constance a reflection of something he understood about the distance between truth and the systems we build to contain it. You know that what you did may have legal consequences, he said. I know. You also know that your accusation against Dr. Briggs, if it is correct, has far greater legal consequences. I know that as well, but I did not make an accusation. Edmund did, and Edmund is dead, and his words died with him unless I carry them forward, and that is what I intend to do. There is the matter of evidence, Holmes said. Edmund's confession to you is hearsay. It cannot convict anyone. If Briggs made an error in Catherine's treatment 23 years ago, the evidence would need to be found elsewhere. Constance looked at him. Then find it, Mr. Holmes. That is why I sent you the note. Holmes was very still. You sent the note. Of course. Who else would have sent it? I opened the coffin, I arranged the scene, and then I sent for the one man in London who would look past the spectacle and find the substance. I did not want a ghost story. I wanted an investigation. You used morning stationery. I adapted plain paper. I did not have time to obtain proper morning stationery. I knew you would notice the border was hand-drawn. I knew that would tell you something about the sender's circumstances, their urgency, their closeness to the situation. I was counting on your eye for detail. Holmes allowed himself the faintest suggestion of a smile. You were not counting on it, Constance. You were relying on it. There is a difference. One implies hope, the other implies certainty. And you are a woman of certainty. He sat down opposite her. Now, tell me everything Edmund told you about Catherine's death. Every detail, every name, every date, everything. What Constance told us over the next hour reshaped the entire landscape of the case. Edmund Calverton had confessed to her that Catherine's scarlet fever, while genuine, had been responding to treatment. She was recovering. But Dr. Briggs, under pressure from Edmund to accelerate the recovery, because Catherine's illness had delayed a critical business negotiation, had administered an experimental drug compound that he had obtained from a colleague abroad. The compound was untested. It interacted catastrophically with the medications Catherine was already receiving. Within 48 hours, Catherine's condition reversed. She died 3 days later. Briggs, terrified, came to Edmund with the truth. Edmund, faced with the choice between exposing the error, which would have destroyed Briggs, created a public scandal, and possibly revealed Edmund's own role in pressuring for faster treatment, or concealing it and attributing the death to the natural course of the fever, chose concealment. They agreed on the story. They signed the death certificate. They buried Catherine with the lie sewn into her shroud, and Edmund, in the years that followed, built his entire life around the architecture of that concealment. He removed Catherine from the household not because her memory was too painful, but because her memory was too dangerous. Every photograph was an accusation. Every mention of her name was a crack in the wall he had built around the truth. He shut down his capacity for emotional connection because emotional connection required vulnerability. And vulnerability risked the kind of openness that might one day, in a moment of weakness or confession, allow the truth to escape. Philip suffered the most. Philip, who loved his father and reached for him and was rebuffed again and again, was not being rejected because Edmund did not love him. He was being rejected because Edmund loved him too much, and love was the force most likely to break the containment. If Edmund allowed himself to feel fully, he would feel everything, including the guilt, and the guilt would destroy the lie, and the lie was all that stood between the family and ruin. Arthur, meanwhile, had become the perfect son precisely because he asked nothing of his father's emotional life. He accepted the transactional model. He learned the business. He became useful. And in doing so, he became the son Edmund could tolerate, not because he was better than Philip, but because he was safer. And then Edmund was dying, and the architecture began to fail. The walls he had built were crumbling. In the morphine haze, in the 3 o'clock silences, in the long grey hours between night and morning, the truth began to seep through. He spoke Catherine's name. He wept. He told Constance things he had never told anyone, and in doing so, he placed in her hands the weight of 23 years of deception and asked her to do what he had never been able to do himself. Holmes listened to all of this, and then he said, "There is one more thing. The morphine." Constance nodded slowly. "Yes, you believe the increased dosage in the final days was not entirely for pain management. I believe that Arthur learned the truth, or some version of it. I believe Dr. Briggs told him. I believe that once Arthur understood what the family's exposure could be if Edmund's deathbed confessions continued, he and Briggs agreed that the confessions needed to stop, and the most efficient way to stop them was to ensure that Edmund's lucid periods ended. You believe they hastened his death. I believe they ensured he died before he could tell anyone else what he had already told me. They did not know he had spoken to me. They thought the secret was still contained. They increased the morphine. Edmund's lucid periods ceased. He died within days. Holmes stood and crossed the room. If this is true, and I believe it may be, then there are two crimes here. The concealment of Catherine's death 23 years ago, and the possible hastening of Edmund's death to prevent that concealment from being exposed. Dr. Briggs is at the center of both. And Arthur? Holmes paused. Arthur is at the center of the second. Whether he understood fully what he was authorizing is a question I cannot yet answer. It is the difference between conspiracy and cowardice, and the distinction, while legally significant, is emotionally almost irrelevant. In both cases, he chose the preservation of the family's reputation over his father's right to die with the truth on his lips. He turned to Constance. "You have given me the narrative. Now I need the evidence, the medication notebook, the records of Briggs's visits. And one more thing. Catherine's niche. Yes, you noticed the resealed mortar as well. I did. I believe Edmund placed something inside Catherine's niche, behind the marker. Years ago, when the guilt was at its worst. A document, a letter, something that would serve as a confession if it were ever found. A failsafe against his own cowardice. That is conjecture. It is. But it is the kind of conjecture that Edmund would have made real. He was a man who planned for every contingency. He built his business on redundancy and risk mitigation. He would not have carried a secret of that magnitude without creating a record. And the safest place to keep a record of what you did to your wife is inside the walls of her grave, where no one would ever look unless they already knew to look there. Holmes studied her. You are a remarkable woman, Constance. I am a woman who sat with a dying man and heard the truth and could not let it be buried with him. That is not remarkable. That is simply the minimum of what a decent person should do. The following morning, Holmes arranged for the opening of Catherine Calverton's niche in the presence of Sutfield, myself, and a representative from Scotland Yard whom Holmes had briefed the previous evening. The Calverton family was not present. Holmes had specifically requested their absence. Behind the stone marker, sealed in a tin box wrapped in oilcloth, we found a letter. It was written in Edmund Calverton's hand, dated 8 years prior, and it was addressed to no one. It was not a letter in the conventional sense. It was a confession, detailed, specific, and devastating. It described Catherine's illness, her recovery, Briggs's experimental treatment, the catastrophic reaction, her death, and the agreement between Edmund and Briggs to conceal the cause. It included dates, the name of the compound Briggs had used, and the name of the colleague who had supplied it. It included Edmund's acknowledgement of his own role in pressuring Briggs for faster results, and it included a single paragraph at the very end that was not about Catherine or Briggs or medicine at all. "I have spent my life since Catherine's death as a man made of duty," Edmund had written. "I have raised my sons without tenderness because tenderness required me to feel, and feeling meant remembering, and remembering meant facing what I allowed to happen. I have punished Philip for loving me because his love was a mirror I could not look into. I have rewarded Arthur for his obedience because obedience asked nothing of my heart. I have allowed Helena to give her life to my household without ever truly thanking her because gratitude requires the acknowledgement of debt, and I could not afford to acknowledge any debt when the greatest debt I owed was to a woman I helped to kill. I am writing this because I know I will never have the courage to say it aloud. I am a coward. I have always been a coward, and the worst form of cowardice is the kind that wears the face of strength and fools everyone, including yourself." Holmes read this passage once, in the cold air of the crypt, and then set the letter down. He said nothing for a long time. The Scotland Yard man cleared his throat. Sutfield stood with his head bowed. I, for my part, felt the kind of sorrow that does not arrive sharply, but settles over you like weather, slowly, completely, and without any clear moment of beginning. "There is enough here to open an inquiry into Dr. Briggs," Holmes said at last. "Whether a prosecution follows will depend on what the medical records reveal and whether the compound can be identified and its effects confirmed after this length of time. The question of Edmund's own death and the role of the increased morphine is a separate matter and will require its own investigation." He paused. "But the crime that this family will struggle with most is not the medical error. It is not the concealment. It is not even the possibility that Edmund's death was hastened. The crime they will struggle with is the one that Edmund confessed to in that letter. The crime of living inside a lie so thoroughly that it became indistinguishable from identity. The crime of turning grief into erasure and calling it strength. The crime of punishing love because love was the one force that could have broken the wall, and the wall was all that stood between a man and the truth about himself. The investigation that followed was methodical and quiet, conducted away from the newspapers and the public eye, in keeping with Holmes's preference for resolution over spectacle. Dr. Briggs was interviewed and confronted with Edmund's letter and Constance's detailed medication records, which showed a pattern of dosage increases that could not be justified by the medical notes alone, he confessed. Not dramatically, not with the operatic guilt that fiction attributes to men who are caught. He confessed the way a man confesses who has been carrying a weight for so long that its removal feels less like defeat than like the end of a very long illness. He confirmed that his treatment of Catherine had been reckless, driven by Edmund's pressure and his own arrogance. He confirmed that they had agreed to conceal the cause of death, and he confirmed, with a quietness that was almost peaceful, that he had increased Edmund's morphine in the final days at Arthur's request, though Arthur had framed it not as an instruction to hasten death, but as a concerned son's plea to ensure his father felt no pain. The ambiguity was deliberate. Arthur had never said the words. He had simply created the conditions in which Briggs understood what was wanted without it ever being explicitly stated. Arthur, when confronted, denied everything, then denied less, then sat in silence for a very long time and finally said, "I did not want him to die. I wanted him to stop talking." It was, perhaps, the most honest thing Arthur Calverton had ever said, and in its honesty it revealed the full, terrible inheritance of Edmund's legacy. Arthur had learned his father's lesson perfectly. When truth threatens the structure, silence it. When emotion threatens control, contain it. When the dying speak too freely, increase the dosage, not out of malice, out of the same desperate, exhausting compulsion to protect the architecture of respectability that had governed this family for a generation. Philip learned the truth in stages, delivered by Holmes with a care and gentleness that I found surprising and moving. Holmes understood that Philip, of all the Calvertons, would be most damaged by the revelation, because Philip was the one who had spent his life seeking his father's love, and would now learn that the love had been there all along, imprisoned behind a wall of guilt that had nothing to do with him. The rejection had never been about Philip's inadequacy. It had been about Edmund's shame. Philip had spent 29 years blaming himself for a distance that had been created by a secret he never knew existed. When Philip understood this, he did not cry, he did not rage. He sat very still, and his face did something I have only seen a few times in my life. It rearranged itself. The exhaustion, the self-doubt, the habitual posture of someone bracing for rejection, all of it shifted, and underneath for just a moment I saw the face of a man who had been released from a prison he had not known he was in. "He loved me," Philip said. "Yes," Holmes said, "badly, and in silence, and with terrible cost. But yes." Helena, when she learned the truth about Catherine's death, was the least surprised of anyone. She told Holmes that she had suspected for years that something was wrong about the way Catherine died, about the speed of the decline, about Briggs's behavior in the weeks afterward, about Edmund's sudden and total erasure of his wife's memory. She had never investigated because investigation would have required confrontation, and confrontation would have threatened her position in the household, and her position was all she had. "I chose my comfort over the truth," she said. "I knew something was wrong and I looked away because looking directly at it would have cost me everything I had built. My home, my role, my place in this family. I was a coward, Mr. Holmes, just like Edmund, just like all of us." Margaret, who had understood more than she had revealed and less than she had pretended, received the news with the composure she had shown throughout. But her hand went to her brooch one final time, and this time she removed it. She looked at it, a small oval of jet on a silver pin, and set it on the table. "It was Catherine's," she said. "Helena gave it to me when I married Arthur. She said it was for luck. I wore it every day because I thought it connected me to the family's history. Now I know what that history actually contains, and I find I do not want it against my skin any longer." And Constance Dyer, who had started everything by opening a coffin in the dark, who had carried a dying man's confession through the night and staged an impossible event to force a family to face what it had spent decades hiding, was quiet at the end. She faced no criminal charges. The disturbance of the coffin was a civil matter, and the Calverton family, by that point, had no interest in pursuing it. She had done what Edmund asked. She had made sure the truth came out. I asked her, some days later, whether she felt she had done the right thing. "I feel I did the necessary thing," she said. "Whether it was right, I cannot say. The truth destroyed a great deal. Arthur may face prosecution. Briggs certainly will. The family's name will suffer. Philip will spend years trying to reconcile his grief with what he now knows. Helena will carry her own guilt for the rest of her life. The truth did not fix anything, Dr. Watson. It simply made the damage visible. And is that better?" She thought about it. "I think it is better to live with visible damage than with invisible rot. Invisible rot spreads. It corrupts everything it touches. It turned Edmund into a hollow man and his sons into strangers, and his sister into a silent accomplice, and his family into a performance. Visible damage can at least be faced. It can be mourned. It can, with time, be repaired. Or if not repaired, then at least acknowledged. And acknowledgement is the beginning of something. I do not know what, but it is the beginning." Holmes and I returned to Baker Street on an evening that was, for once, clear. The rain had stopped. The fog had lifted. London for a few hours looked like a city instead of a haunting. Holmes sat in his chair by the fire and did not speak for a long time. I had learned over the years to recognize his silences, to distinguish between the silence of thought, the silence of boredom, and the silence of something deeper, something that the work had touched in him that he did not fully wish to examine. This was the third kind. "The coffin was never the mystery," he said finally. "No," I agreed. "The mystery was the family. The mystery is always the family. Every locked room I have ever entered, every impossible crime I have ever solved, has ultimately been a story about people and the distances between them. The mechanisms are clever, the poisons are exotic, the alibis are intricate, but beneath all of it always there is the same engine: fear, shame, the desperate human need to be seen as something other than what we are." He paused. "Edmund Calverton was not a villain. He was a man who made a terrible choice in a moment of grief, and then spent the rest of his life building a fortress around that choice, and the fortress became his identity, and his identity became his prison, and his prison became his family's inheritance. His sons did not inherit his money or his business. They inherited his walls. Arthur learned to live inside them. Philip spent his life trying to climb over them, and neither of them knew the walls existed until a woman who had listened to a dying man in the dark had the courage to open a coffin and let the silence out. He looked at the fire. We solve cases, Watson. We find murderers and thieves and forgers and conspirators. But the crimes that do the most damage are not the ones committed with weapons or poison. They are the ones committed with silence, with avoidance, with the quiet, daily decision to protect a lie rather than face a truth. Those are the crimes that pass from generation to generation. Those are the crimes that shape families and destroy them from the inside while the outside remains perfectly, respectably intact. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about the silences in your own life, or the walls that families build around the things they cannot say, then it did what it was meant to do. Stories like these are not puzzles to be solved and forgotten. They are mirrors. And sometimes the most unsettling thing a mirror can show you is not a ghost, but your own reflection, sitting quietly in a room full of things you have chosen not to see. I have one more thought to share before we part. Some weeks after the case concluded, I received a letter from Philip Calverton. It was brief and carefully written, and it contained a passage that I have thought about many times since. "I visited my father's grave yesterday," he wrote. "It was the first time since the funeral. I brought a book of Tennyson, the same one I had been reading to him at the end. I sat on the stone bench near the crypt and I read aloud for an hour. No one was there, no one heard, but I read anyway, because I spent my whole life trying to share the things I loved with him, and I have decided that I am not going to stop now. Not because I believe he can hear me, but because the reaching was never the mistake. The stopping was." I showed the letter to Holmes. He read it once and handed it back. "That," he said quietly, "is as close to a solution as this case will ever have. And perhaps it is as close to a solution as any of us will ever have. Not the solving of the crime, not the revelation of the secret, not the punishment of the guilty, but the decision, made quietly, alone, in a cemetery in the rain, to keep reaching toward the people who could not reach back, to keep offering love to the silence, to keep speaking into the dark, not because someone is listening, but because the speaking itself is the only honest thing left." The coffin at Harrogate was opened from the outside, but what it released had been locked inside that family for 23 years, longer than the dead woman had been in her grave, longer than the sons had been alive enough to understand it, longer than the silence had been sustainable. And when it finally came out, it did not come out as a ghost or a miracle or a horror. It came out as the truth. Quiet, painful, overdue, and utterly, irreversibly human. The candles in the chapel were relit the following week for Edmund's proper burial. The crypt was opened. He was placed in his niche, beside Catherine, where he had always belonged and where, for 23 years, he had been too ashamed to go. The passage between the crypt and the chapel was sealed for the final time, with real mortar, permanent and thick, and the family stood together in the cold October air, not as the polished, respectable unit they had once performed, but as what they actually were: damaged, uncertain, grieving, and, for the first time in any of their memories, honest. It was not a happy ending. It was something rarer. It was a true one.